Now, going into SCIP reference IDs. SCIP reference IDs are basically the ID that you receive from the database when you make a submission. So I take my wireless router, I submit a dossier to the database, I receive a SCIP reference ID in response. I can now provide that reference ID to importers and distributors, and they can use that when they're placing my router on the market to do a simplified submission. They simply enter my reference ID and say, I'm placing this on the market, and they don't have to build a whole dossier. Also, my customers and integrators, if they're using my product and theirs, I can give them the reference ID, and instead of listing all the SCIP parameters for my article in their SCIP dossier, they can just list the reference ID. It's called referencing. So these are very powerful when they're available, but they're not readily available, and the reason for that is varied. Obviously, some EU suppliers have just not done their submissions yet. They don't have them. Asian suppliers can't make submissions, and their supply chains are so complex that they can't figure out an actor in there that's willing to take the responsibility of doing the initial submission so they could provide you that reference ID. They probably will work that out eventually, but right now they're not able to give you those reference IDs. And then some suppliers have incorrectly provided reference IDs. And probably most of the cases of that is they've made a submission to the trial database, and then not knowing that that's not a real submission, they're providing the response they got from the trial database as if it were a submission to the production database. And then when we go to use that reference ID, it fails because it's not a production database reference ID. Now, the problem here is that since these are not available, we have to be able to cover all the SCIP parameters, whether the reference ID is available or not. So if they don't give us a reference ID, then we have to provide the article, the concentration, the category code, the material code. All of that information has to be provided then because we don't have this reference ID. With reference IDs, don't rely on them. Not all suppliers will have them. Be prepared to process notifications, including items without reference IDs. Reference IDs from the pilot database are not valid, should not be shared, should not be accepted. But unfortunately, we have no way to confirm if an ID is valid or not yet because the public-facing database has not been released by the European Chemicals Agency. So the only way that I can tell if a reference ID I've received from a supplier is valid is to put it in my dossier, submit my dossier, and see if my dossier gets rejected because the ID is not valid. There's no other way. There's no way to check it, to confirm it. That will change when the public database is released. I don't have a date on that. I think the European Chemicals Agency has pushed it out a couple times. I don't know what the latest date is. The next IT user group meeting is May 27, and maybe we'll get some more feedback on that.
Learn more by viewing the full-length video online at greensofttech.com/videos. Plus, learn about our environmental regulation solutions online at greensofttech.com.